Welcome to the Crypto Policy Symposium and our panel, Crypto Innovation, What's the Danger? The crypto industry has grown spectacularly fast in recent years by rapidly innovating in terms of the products it provides. From ever more basic cryptocurrencies to MFTs to crypto lending, crypto derivatives, and more recently, the spectacularly explosive world of algorithmic stablecoins. Now, one of the features of this innovation is it's actually grown up around the edges of conventional laws and regulations. And there's places where it seems to have actually grown up in a way that's been the innovation has grown up in a way which seems to actually be to avoid regulations, and a lot of the original principles, ideological principles that drove the cryptocurrency revolution are based in very libertarian mindset about minimal interference with governments. So we're going to discuss this topic today with an amazing panel. So we have Edmund Schuster, Associate Professor of Corporate Law at the London School of Economics. Hi, Edmund.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for inviting me.
Kelvin, Professor of Law at the National University of Singapore. Natasha Teran, who is an expert on payments and co-author of a brilliant book about fintech called The Payoff. And she's also very heavily involved in a variety of regulatory initiatives. And lastly, we have Jared Bibler. Now, Jared is the author of a really great book called Iceland's Secret, the Untold Story of the world's biggest con. I can't make my mind up which of Natasha or Jared's book is my favorite of the last year or two, which tells the story of how the great financial crisis impacted Iceland, and how Jared, working for the regulators, actually helped do something which basically never happened anywhere else, is actually bring some of the guilty parties to justice. So we're actually going to start off with some context before we actually talk about crypto. So Jared, would you care to tell us about the great Icelandic financial bubble, the subsequent crisis, and to what extent that was driven by a weak regulation and a belief that innovation was always good?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me, Martin, and greetings to the other panelists. It's really a pleasure to be here. Yeah, the Iceland story is really, unfortunately, it was kind of missed because the global financial crisis was so huge, and Iceland just got lumped in as kind of a canary in the coal mine at the beginning of the crisis, and kind of the reporters came for a couple of days and then they left and never came back. So the story is really not very much to do at all with subprime or the other 2008 causes. It's really kind of a homegrown story of greed and rapid growth of the banking sector, and a lot of fraud, a lot of crime ultimately underpinning that. So we had Iceland at the time, around 2000. Iceland had, I believe, about 270,000 people. So although it's a big country geographically, it's a small country by population. And Iceland had a few banks to serve that small population, to serve the fishing industry and the agriculture industry. So it had three, I called them the big banks, but they weren't that big. They were sort of privatized in a very cronyistic way, let's say, in the early 2000s. And then they rapidly grew. They were able to go to mainly Germany in the beginning, mainly like Deutsche Bank, the other big German banks. Later, the wholesale European lending markets. They were able to sort of, on the nice reputation of Iceland as being a pure world of the North, the home of Nordic mythology and so on, they were able to borrow kind of by Icelandic standards, like almost unlimited money for a few years. And those banks were able to double their size of their balance sheets every year for like 3, 4, 5 years.
Wow.
And so they grew from these tiny banks serving 250,000 people. They grew that each of those banks became about the size of Enron by 2008. So we had 3 Enrons, and the 3 Enrons collapsed in 3 days, basically, in the beginning of October 2008. So the final trigger for their collapse was the collapse of Lehman and the beginning of the big problems of the GFC. But those banks had been really running on fumes, had been had been insolvent actually, probably for 3 or 4 years before that. But they were able to just keep borrowing and doubling in size without any check. And then I was hired. I had been living there, so personally, my story is that I lived there. I worked as an asset manager in one of those banks. I was having a great life. The party was on in Iceland. Everybody was flying all around the world and doing, crazy things. And then I quit my job about 2 days, the Friday before the collapse, because I didn't like what we were doing. That you can read about this in the book. But I was hired by the regulator after the crisis to sort of look into these banks. And what we found, and this is kind of the story of the book, Iceland's Secret, what we found was the largest cases of share market manipulation that the world had ever seen. So what it turned out was that the market for these shares of these 3 Enron-sized banks was quite weak. After about 2003, probably, there wasn't much demand for the shares, although the banks still wanted to grow. The share price would have started to slide. And so to prevent it from sliding, the banks used their own money secretly through their own proprietary trading operations and bought their own shares. And they continued to buy as many as they needed to buy to keep the share price up, to keep it rising. And these banks were so big compared to the size of the economy and the stock market that they took over the whole market. By the end, they were about, the 3 together were about 75% of the market cap of the market. Plus there were, go ahead.
So their big innovation was just blatant outright fraud.
Yes, not so much innovation. Well, it was innovative because actually, and you'll see this in the book. We don't have time for it now. I don't want to talk about it too much, but there was a lot of innovation in how they needed to hide those shares off the balance sheet once they had bought them, and in effect, each bank's entire operation, all the important departments of the bank became involved in that scam. So everybody, even the general counsel, even of course the CEOs, the board chairman of the board in one case, their job became buying and hiding their own shares, because by the end, some days they were buying 100% of the market volume of their own shares. So there was no market. And when the market collapsed, when the banks collapsed, the market collapsed. So in 2008, the Icelandic stock market lost 97% of its value in just a couple of months. So that's basically, I've given you the basic story.
So what I find, I have to confess, I have a terrible past. I was working in an investment bank at that time, and we were looking at Iceland and just scratching our head and thinking, what's the story? This doesn't make sense. They're buying everything. We're lending them huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
There's these 3 banks which all have massive cross shareholdings with each other and lend each other money.
Yes.
There must be some story someone is telling other than this. These are like nice people from a Nordic paradise who wouldn't do anything bad.
Well, Martin, that's an excellent point, because on the back, and that's really important, on the back of the manipulation of their own share, market cap, basically, they could set their own market cap. On the back of that, they could then borrow 10, 20 times more from banks like yours to grow the bank. And, you can keep that up for some time, apparently. In one case, I realized as I was prepping for the book, one case it went actually 10 years. So one of the banks did this for 10 years.
10 years, wow.
Yeah. So the example of this book, the reason I wrote the book is not to punish my adopted home country of Iceland, which I love, but to kind of shine a light on the weakness that's embedded in our financial system everywhere. Although not everybody seems to get that. So an MIT classmate, acquaintance of mine, wrote me the other day, and he said, "I finished your book. It's so sad about Iceland. When can they get their act together?" I was like, I guess maybe the message is too abstract, but the idea that you could have the stock market of an entire nation kind of painted for 10 years or 5 years by a few players, a few interlinked banks, it's admittedly extreme, but I think it's of a piece with what's going on everywhere. You know, with the way that we've built our financial and regulatory system, the incentives that we've put in, we favor revolving doors between the financial sector and regulators, and we don't really dissuade. There's no big incentive for bringing in a big case like ours. In fact, as soon as I had done these cases, my team, even though we were still in the middle of massive investigations, our team was basically, even in Iceland, was dismantled. So, I guess getting this back to crypto, if we haven't solved the problem of this type of serious crime in our regular daily financial market, why do we expect, and if crypto is replicating those things, then we shouldn't be surprised that we have problems there.
So one of the things which we're actually discussing in other panels as well, but both in relation to crypto and to conventional finance, is frequently the slowness of regulators to act.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's this layer of complexity and confusion, which is kind of an excuse, and sometimes they actually seem to understand what's going on, but just don't seem to do anything. Is there any sort of, you've mentioned the revolving door, but is there any sort of structural thing in the makeup of regulators that it actually slows them down in terms of actually acting when there are frankly bad things happening in the financial sector?
Well, and I know this isn't specific again to Iceland, but I know that this is true in other countries as well. In Iceland, the regulator relies on the financial sector for its budget.
Yes. And
so even one of the crazy things when I started investigating these big market abuse cases, I was alone, really. There was no team. It was just me and some computer screens. And I kept saying, I need some help. You know, these are the biggest cases in the world. We have 3 Enrons to look at and so on. And we relied on the shells of the bankrupt banks, which were now being run by lawyers, winding them down. They had to approve our request for more people to investigate them. And that took a year.
Wow.
So I mean, you couldn't almost set up a more kind of toothpicks and bubblegum system if you wanted, I think. I mean, and this is not specific to Iceland, although Iceland is small enough that you can see these things very clearly. But I think these patterns exist more broadly.
Yeah. So just one final thing I wanted to ask you before we hand over to Natasha. I remember in the aftermath of the great financial crisis that financial innovation became a dirty word, dirty phrase. People didn't like to talk about it. Not that there was anything wrong with being genuinely innovative, but it was so associated with people doing bad things or hiding bad things behind a layer of complexity. But in the last few years, I've noticed that regulators in several jurisdictions have actually taken on board that innovation is part of their objectives. I was just wondering, what's your thoughts about innovators actually having innovation as an objective in terms of the financial sector?
I mean, I guess that's okay if it's genuine, but I keep coming back to the real lack of incentive for cleaning up bad things that are happening. You know, you have regulators like the Americans they put out a lot of press releases, the SEC, and they do some good stuff. And I think maybe with Gary Gensler, they're getting more maybe courageous, but a lot of what they do is they'll happily go after small time people. And even in Iceland, as a holiday project, we went after a small time scammer and shut him down. And that's fun. And it's easy. It's so easy.
Yes. But
to go after, you know, I don't know if you follow this JP Morgan trial. I'm very happy that this came to light, but JP Morgan recently, I believe they were convicted. They were on trial for many years manipulating the precious metals markets. But those cases are rare and they really shouldn't be. I think there's a lot more of those that we aren't looking at. Okay, thank you. So Natasha, you come from one of the most tightly regulated parts of the financial sector, the world of payments, which is also a sector which has actually seen
a lot of innovation. Could you tell us about your experience in that area of actually how genuine value-added innovation can actually happen, but within a very restrictive regulatory framework?
Thank you, Martin. And maybe just to preface my contribution here today, you describe me as a payments expert. I'm a sort of observer, a non-expert observer.
Very keen and knowledgeable observer based on the payoff.
Well, that's kind. It was a co-authored book. But I'd like to start just by, making two comments. Firstly, I think payments are this hugely important, ignored part of our lives, not just of finance, but of our societies, that kind of underpins the way that our societies work. And the more that the act of payment is abstracted away from really our sensory perceptions of paying, if you will, the less we think about it. And that could be, that could be good for commerce, it can be good for efficiency, it can be good for many things. But the more that we ignore this enormous construct on which our societies and economies completely depend. And I think that's an important context in which to think about crypto, and how crypto has had some enthusiasm behind it, because people have been so abstracted away from what it is actually, what payment and money actually is, and its purpose, and it's a hugely enabling function to allow us to transmit value and economically interact with each other. We're so far away from that in our experience, or most people are, that when people come up with this idea of a new currency, they think fantastic, that's a great thing. I want to have this new form of paying and system separate from the one in which I actually coexist with my fellow civilians. The second thing I'd say is that you say it's a very heavily regulated sector. I think banks are very heavily regulated. That's true. But banks are no longer at the centre of payments, and it's no longer a bank failing necessarily that would bring, would be the most detrimental thing to a nation's payment system with a capital S. It could be a cloud provider. It could be, it's more likely to be a technology provider than it is a bank. A big clearing bank going down is not going to be helpful. But if the technological infrastructure sitting behind the whole show goes down, that's a much bigger consequence. And we haven't seen a huge amount of regulation of that yet. I think we will. I think we're starting to see it. But obviously a lot of that transcends borders. A lot of it's not local, depending on the country you're in. A lot of these are very, very big organizations, and it becomes complex to address them. And maybe to touch on one of your questions to Jared just now, why are regulators slow? Well, regulators can only regulate what they're allowed to regulate. They have to be, they don't get up in the morning and go, right, I'm going to start regulating, this new thing because I want to. Clearly, if it's an institution acting in their purview, they can. But if it's a new activity that's not inside their regulatory ambit, they don't have license just to sort of wake up and slap on rules on things. They have to be included into their orbit. And I think that's something we forget about sometimes when we think when we discuss why are regulators slow, why haven't they acted on this? It's because they didn't have the license to do so. And we probably don't want to give regulators the absolute authority to sort of shift their boundaries at will. But in an environment where innovation is happening very fast, maybe there needs to be a more elastic border, or a more efficient process to elasticate the borders of their. So
when we think about innovations that actually happen in payments, which I think people underappreciate, things like faster payments, contactless payments, whole bunch of things which have, I think that they've probably actually made far more traction in Europe and the developing world than actually in the United States, who are only just now looking at faster payments. Is part of the reason that's actually grown in a more value-added, controlled way, because each of those innovations was very clearly within existing regulatory perimeters.
But the same could be said of the United States. And why haven't they moved as fast as.
No, I
as-
mean, it's not a question about how fast they've moved, but have these things, have these innovations happened which have happened in actually a value generating and very controlled way? Is that because they were actually clearly within a regulatory perimeter, as opposed to what you're talking about earlier, that a lot of the other areas of finance where things might not have been regulated because it's not obvious it's actually within the remit of a regulator?
I think a lot of the innovations took off very fast. You know, the ones that you're talking about, sort of contactless payments, and I'm not sure that faster payments has taken off hugely fast, but they've been transitions within existing systems or additions to existing systems rather than completely novel systems outside, separate to and distant from the existing. But you know, some of the innovations and some of the companies have grown incredibly fast and are yet not inside the perimeter. They're supporting activities and cannibalizing activities within the perimeter.
Okay.
But they're not themselves necessarily inside the perimeter as things stand today,
Okay.
I think.
Okay, so does this apply to what I would regard as payments companies which have actually moved into more sort of quasi banking type activities?
Yes, or tech companies. Yes, tech payment companies who are sort of, you know, could be considered banks and might be considered banks and perhaps should be considered banks, but really aren't, or are facilitating so much of the value transfer within given economies, whether be they, you know, virtual internet economies or national economies, that they actually become more consequential to those economies than a bank as such does in the transfer of value.
Okay. So potentially even within what we might call the conventional, as opposed to the crypto payment space, there is still work for not just regulators but actual legislators to sort of just catch up with what's happened. Because I think that's a very valid key point you made about regulators can only regulate something they have the power to regulate. They can't make up primary legislation to say I'm going to go and regulate this thing which is way beyond existing statute.
Correct. And I think because there has been such huge progress and such huge transition in the way that money moves and the providers that have become very, very big and of huge consequence to individual nations and nations collectively. And regulators haven't, you know, in all cases, and been given the power to, you know, to start to inspect some of these companies. And that's not saying them are doing any ill necessarily, but a bank's operational risk is one thing. A tech company's operational risk bears equal inspection if the dependence on that tech company is so large as it might be.
So just one final question on this area, which I think will help frame some of the discussions about the crypto world, is very large part of payments, particularly the core infrastructure. It's treated in a very particular way in terms of operational resilience, management of operational risk, coming from the BIS principles for financial market infrastructure downwards, which has actually then got incorporated to a lot of national laws, national laws and regulations. How important do you think that's actually is to banking, is the actual, sorry, to payments, the whole question about accountability, operational resilience, and how much is that actually part of the regulatory agenda in terms of day-to-day activities of the regulator? Because by contrast, as we're going to get onto into the crypto world, there's often not an accountable party to point to in terms of who's actually running what can be quite key infrastructure.
So I slightly lost what the question was. So how important?
How much attention in the payments world where operational risk, operational resilience is actually really important. As you said, yeah. It's not, a bank can go down, but if the payment systems go down, it's like civilization ends and we run around. How much so in terms of payments regulation, how much attention on a day-to-day basis do the regulators pay to things like accountability, operational risk, operational resilience?
Well, I mean, that's more of a question for the regulators than me. And one regulator in one country is very different to a regulator in another. But I think it's fair to say that that amount of attention is increasing all the time. And certainly in the UK, you can see that there's more and more of it. What that means in terms of the distribution of attention on it, I don't know. But I can only imagine it's growing just from the amount of sort of output that we see from them, and whether it's in their speeches or guidance notes or otherwise. But given the huge dependence that we have as societies on value being able to move, and you sort of mentioned that Armageddon scenario in which it can't.
Yes.
You could question whether it's ever sufficient. I mean, it's a sort of it's not climate change, a reversible risk. But notwithstanding that, the lights cannot go out in payments. They just can't anymore. So given that, what is enough attention?
Okay. Well, thank you, Jared and Natasha, for insights into what we might call the real world. So Kelvin and Edmund, I think you might have heard some very interesting parallels there with the crypto world, which I know you, crypto and the public blockchain world, which I know you have both been paying a great deal of attention to while maintaining your careers in academic law. I mean, what's your general thoughts in terms of the way the crypto industry's grown up? What kind of risks we face? Does it seem a bit more like Iceland, or a bit more controlled to the payments area, where I think, if you look at many of the fundamental use cases for crypto, it's actually saying this is an alternative to payments. So Kelvin, Edmund, what's your thoughts?
Right.
Yeah.
Edmund, do you want to start?
I'm happy to. Up to you. So my kind of initial reaction to what Jared and Natasha have been saying, I think especially Jared, when you talk about the incentives of regulators, I used to be a regulator. I completely understand that this is a problem, but I think in practice, if we're not talking about kind of post-mortem kind of investigations, the biggest problem really is that you have the regulated who, if what they are selling is profitable enough, have near unlimited resources, and they can use those resources in a way that makes regulating industries, especially new industries, very difficult, because they can obscure what they are actually doing. They can always kind of raise the bar for the regulator's technical understanding to understand the simplest ideas, because they are wrapped in complexity and made obscure on purpose in order to make it harder to regulate. And I mean, we've clearly seen that in the ICO space, with different types of agreements. Whenever some regulator raised an eyebrow, you had an additional term added to a white paper, which makes it even more ridiculous, but also kind of seems to put the token sale outside the regulatory ambit of this particular regulator, and so on. So this is I think a big problem that, especially in crypto, I think is probably more important, more impactful than incentive problems. And then we have, and Martin, you mentioned primary legislation, and we have this problem that our politicians want to be seen in this new tech world. They want to be seen as keeping up with the times, despite their very limited understanding of technology. They want to appear like tech gurus. And we have people, I mean, in the UK, our former Chancellor of the Exchequer, he proposed blockchain as a solution to the Northern Ireland, to the Irish border problem, right? And I mean, he did that with a straight face. And clearly, you cannot propose that if you have the slightest idea of what the problems, Brexit-related problems on the Irish border were, and if you understand what blockchain technology is. This is just insane, right? But if you have this incentive by politicians to say something that sounds like, keeping up with the times, and you have these financial incentives for the potentially regulated to obscure things, then you end up in a space where everyone is kind of happy to just step back and let stuff happen, because it's kind of the dominant strategy. And Martin, you mentioned this kind of trade-off between innovation and regulation, and I think in a way we have to be honest and critical about that. There is no question that regulation hampers innovation, right? There's no question that if you regulate something, if you increase the regulatory hurdle for doing something new, then there will be less progress, and the progress will be slower, and some projects will never get off the ground. But what I think, to kind of lead that into the crypto space, what has been missing completely in the crypto space is an honest debate about the potential benefits. And this is something that we understand quite well. We've just lived through COVID, right? We understand that there needs to be regulation of vaccines and medicines and so on. But in dealing with that, we need to keep an eye on the potential benefits and the potential risks. And in the crypto space, my observation is that without ever discussing, without ever making the crypto proponents explain exactly what they are trying, what it is that they could potentially generate, that they could create, they're allowed to basically just say, this is new. Nobody understood the internet in 1994. So let's see what happens. So they are not actually giving us concrete benefits. But then they turn around and say, regulating us at this early point will completely hamper innovation. Innovation for what, right? So if a case could be made for a specific application that is not replicable with the traditional system, and that is really promising, then we can have an honest debate about it. But of course, it's not a coincidence that we don't have this discussion, because the actual, unique selling point is basically illegal payments and stuff like that, right? There's nothing else they have to offer. So of course, we don't really have an honest debate about that, right? There is nothing. If somebody had to explain in what way a tokenized security, a wrapped Apple share on an Ethereum token, is somehow superior to a broker-dealer uploading an app to the Apple App Store and letting people trade fractional shares. If they had to explain that, then obviously the project would go away, because there is no advantage.
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes that's come up quite strongly in other panels is that the crypto industry comes along with what they say are solutions. This is better, but there is both a lack of actual definition of this is the problem and the extent of the problem by the crypto industry, and there seems to be a lack of actual critical reasoning, questioning from policymakers, decision makers about. So, what's the problem you're trying to solve? That seems to be quite a general theme, and it's one of the things I think we're trying to encourage with this symposium, is to actually get people to ask the right questions about what's the problem you're trying to solve. Why is this a better solution?
Yeah, and one point that always enrages me about the crypto space is that it's this typical approach of not understanding the reasons why our systems are so complex and so inefficient and so bad. And I call it a junior business consultant problem, right? You come to a factory and you have like 2 weeks of work experience and say, why don't you do it completely differently? We should put this there and this there. And clearly this is based on not understanding how things have grown into what they are now. Yeah. And so this is very seductive for politicians, because people say, the payment space is a good example, right? You say, well, wouldn't it be great to be able to send payments via text message? And that's what my token can do. And that sounds great, but it only sounds great if you don't understand the the whole backbone, the grown system behind it, the political trade-offs, all these problems, if you don't understand them, then yes, it sounds great. Why don't we just have, iMessage payments like systems, and let's rebuild the whole financial system like that.
Yes. If I could just ask one final question before we hand over to Kelvin. You mentioned some very, very strong reasons why the regulators don't necessarily act, or they act slowly. Now, one particular segment of the regulatory world is the central banks, and I've been talking to central bankers and looking at the kind of the research they're doing. And one common theme that has gone on for in that research for years is basically, we don't need to do anything about crypto because it's not systematically risky or important. And because even where the central bankers have broader range of regulatory responsibilities, they seem to for understandable reasons obsess on the macro-prudential, the system's stability. Do you think that has been a theme as well, and actually slowing back action, even if it is within existing regulations, just the thought this is just not big enough to worry about, which it probably hasn't been until the last 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, I think that certainly plays a part in it, and I think the way this narrative of it not being big enough to warrant regulation, it kind of chimes in with this idea of it being the early internet. This, you don't want to step on this budding new ecosystem. Yes. My gut feeling is it's probably true that it's not systematically important, that it won't be for some time. I believe that is still the case. And the reason I believe that is that I think all the metrics that we look at are probably inflated by all sorts of fraud and wash trading and so on. So I think if you look at actual money flowing in, we're not at a stage where you can say it's more systematically important than other areas of stuff that's going on that's not great. But that is not in itself a reason to ignore it. Certainly not a reason to give it the benefit of the doubt without having this stringent demand for explaining, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Why should we let you do it? And sorry, if I just may say one more thing. I think what Jared said in the beginning about Iceland, there's also this very popular narrative. I'm on Twitter, and I always get shouted at by people who love this whole crypto space, and they hear stories like Jared's, and they say, you see, that's why we need crypto. We need transparency. We need, crypto to replace those corrupt bankers.
Iceland would never have happened if they'd been using Bitcoin.
Exactly. Yeah. So this nonsense also needs to be to be explained to regulators, I think.
So Kelvin, what's your thoughts?
Right. So if I could just build on what Edmund was saying, there's a lot of jargon in this crypto space that makes it very inaccessible, both to regulators and to just regular lay people, right? So there's all kinds of smart contracts, non-fungible tokens. And more often than not, they are abusing those words. So most smart contracts are not contracts. Fungibility is completely misunderstood by the crypto space. If you try and debate these people, they just tell you don't know what you're talking about. So, I have people who have never studied law before tell me I don't understand the concept of ownership. So I've been teaching it wrong in school for 20 over years. And the biggest problem for me really is the press. Our politicians like to quote that the blockchain is a secure, decentralized ledger, right? And the secure part always goes unexplained. How is it secure? And as I like to point out very often, how is it not secure, right? It doesn't provide absolute security because we see hacks all the time, right? So it's clear that it's not absolute security. So what does it secure? The only thing it secures really is it secures the ledger at the ledger end from ex post alterations. Now, if you study frauds, whether it's bank frauds or land registry frauds, in most developed jurisdictions, this doesn't happen at the registry, doesn't happen at the ledger. Most of the frauds target the end user. And the blockchain doesn't protect the end user. The only protection the end user has is public key cryptography, which we've had, by the way, since 1970, mid-1970s. And there's a reason we never rolled out public key cryptography on a wide scale for centralized ledgers, because it doesn't work. It creates more problems than it solves. So you are providing security for a part of the system. The ledger is not the system. The ledger is part of the system where the frauds are not actually happening, and ignoring and actually creating problems for resolving these frauds, because the way the legal system deals with most of these end user frauds is we correct the ledger, right? We rectify the ledger. If your bank account has been hacked, we can rectify your bank account. You get your money back. But because the blockchain is immutable, and immutability is some sacred cow, you can't get your money back. Now, why would we want this system, which the only thing it does really is facilitate fraud? Fraudsters love immutable ledgers, because once they get it off your account, you can't get it back.
And it's not just the technical mutability, is it? It's the fact that the decentralization means there isn't really an accountable person to actually make sure that the right information is going in the first place.
Exactly. It means that you can't go after whoever is keeping the ledger, because it's being kept thousands of copies all over the place. You can't possibly go after all of them. The pseudonymous nature of the entire ecosystem makes it ridiculous. I mean, even if you could trace your Bitcoin, let's say your stolen Bitcoin, to a particular address, who owns that address? Who is it? Who do you sue? Right? Is he within the jurisdiction? Is this a system that will work? I can't see how it would work. So one fundamental problem is that they keep talking about how the blockchain can track provenance. It can't. There is no legal system on the face of this planet, going back several centuries, that treats ownership the way the blockchain does. And I think that tells us it's not attractive to most societies.
So some of the things you're touching at are really, really fundamental to the whole crypto revolution, is the decentralization and the immutability. But it sounds like from what you're describing, these two things are completely the opposite of what financial systems and financial infrastructure actually needs, in terms of both accountability and the ability to both reverse or block transactions. So the very heart, it's actually gone wrong. Is that a fair summary of?
Yes, I mean, in theory, you could have a system whereby everybody is fully responsible if they are hacked, but the fact that no legal system has adopted this position tells us we don't find it appealing.
Yes, and I think in Natasha's book there was the interesting example. I think it was the Bank of Bangladesh, which is often cited by crypto people as a fantastic example of why Bitcoin is better. But Natasha, wasn't it the case that Bank of Bangladesh hacked a lot of? Well, firstly, it was at the end user point that the hack happened, rather than in the actual core SWIFT system. But wasn't a very large proportion of those funds actually blocked or reversed, Natasha?
Well, yeah, a lot of the instructions were never processed. I think the bulk of the instructions sent from the bank to the Fed weren't processed. But then of those that were sent on, I think a fraction were paid out, and most of those were recovered. I think it was very much a subset that were carried out in notes, actually.
So if that had been a crypto hack, basically it would have all gone.
Yes.
And there would have been no one to go to actually reverse it.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Kelvin, any more thoughts before we sort of pull our brains together and actually just try to think about what sort of conclusions or advice we would want to give to policymakers?
I mean, the only other thought I had really was that it's been 13 years already. Let's not buy into it's the early days argument anymore. It would have worked, in 2014 maybe.
So
yeah, but
crypto is no longer a delicate flower of innovation.
I mean, if in 13 years you can't demonstrate a good use case other than fraud, then I think you need to demonstrate, improve yourself before we let you continue innovating.
Okay, so pulling things together, what advice would the members of the panel actually have for regulators, whether it's specific to crypto or just in general in coping with innovation, which isn't necessarily actually value creating innovation? Anyone have anything they want to share? I think you've already touched on several of the key points, or at least define many of the problems in terms of budgeting. The other side, as it were, often have huge funds to actually create confusion, obfuscation. But any positive advice you'd like to share with the audience?
So perhaps what I would say is there's this trend of this catchphrase of being technology neutral. We shouldn't have, the regulators and the legislators pick technology. And in the crypto space, this has actually kind of been turned on its head. It has morphed into, let's not prohibit anything as long as it is using DLT, because it might be valuable, who knows what. So let's be technology neutral in the sense that we shouldn't prohibit anything because it's based on DLT, even though what we are looking at is stuff that only happens in that space. And we should actually take the opposite approach and ask, what are you trying to do? The second thing I would say is, and Mike, the draft regulation on the European level is a good example. We have to be careful not to be too naive. These regulations are now written, obviously written by people who believe they're, these innovators who want to play by the rules and to, deliver really great product, fully compliant. And their big problem was that they've never had any guidance on how to comply with the law, and that's the problem. And this is so naive. If you look at all the projects that have grown big, these are regulatory arbitrage projects, nothing else. And we write regulations that say, we know you just want to know how to publish your white paper. So the EU sits down and writes, these are the key documents that you need to provide, and these are the key bits of information you need to put into your white paper. And one of them, one of the guidelines is you shouldn't lie in your white paper. Well, that is fantastic, but it kind of it really naively misses the point, I think, of the whole regulatory agenda that we should be pursuing. Okay,
Jared, what's your thoughts about hearing about this amazing sector?
This has been a really great panel. I've really enjoyed it. I really appreciated Edmund's comments, especially around making things obscure so that they're difficult to regulate, and like hiding things behind complexity. You can see examples of that also in Iceland's Secret. And also you can see the politician's story in Iceland's Secret is a big part of it. In fact, the prime minister was later found guilty of treason, but that's another thing. But we had the president being flown off to Davos, the president of the country, and defending Iceland as having found, I think he said, the holy grail of finance or something. So definitely that's a piece of this. But I would push back. Edmund said that when things are obscure and when hidden behind complexity, incentives wouldn't maybe solve that problem completely, but wouldn't it solve it a little bit? I mean, if you knew as a young regulator that you could stand to personally benefit, you could get a huge bonus. Let's say you could, wouldn't better people come into regulators, and wouldn't they work harder at taking things down or looking at things critically, finding out those things? So I don't think that's the whole solution, but I still want to push on that a little bit. And the other thing I'd like to say is, like, haven't we ourselves? Look, and I'm not a lawyer. I was a mechanical engineer from MIT. So I mean, I'm a simple man. But haven't we created a regulatory world with its codes and its jargon that also obscures reality. So in other words, let's take an example, front running a trade. If I'm a broker and I get a pension fund who calls me and they want to buy 50 million worth of some obscure fixed income bond or something, and I front run that trade. In other words, I buy a little bit of the bond for myself before I execute the trade, and I sell the bond after, and I make some profit on that. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but isn't that just, am I not just stealing from that person? Have I not just stolen a bit of money from that? And
so looking through the facade to the economic potentials.
I mean, I think, I'm not a lawyer, but I think stealing is a crime in most jurisdictions, just stealing money. But we dress it up in this whole thing, and we spent 5 years prosecuting front running, when really it's just the guy stole $100,000 or whatever.
We only have a few minutes left.
Oh, sorry.
So let's go back to a lawyer. Kelvin, any final thoughts from you?
Right. So I think the complexity in the law actually serves a purpose, right? It's not designed to intentionally be complex. It's the result of the fact that our social lives are complex, right? We have complex relationships, and therefore what counts as theft, right? So what you've described is not theft, because you haven't taken property belonging to another. You've taken value, but not property, right? And there's a certain amount of circularity in reasoning. You say you've taken his value, but why is it his? So that's the reason why there is complexity in the law, but that's not the reason why we see complexity in crypto, right? The complexity in crypto is just entirely made up to blow smoke up everybody's eyes, so nobody can see anything.
Okay,
that's the difference.
Thank you, Natasha. Any final thoughts from you?
Well, I'm a big fan of the idea of the plain use of the English language and as a starting point for getting rid of a lot of the complexity in the policy world and the regulatory world as well. I think that would do everyone a service, but also kind of lower the barriers to partly to entry, but also to consumers understanding what they're being protected against and for. And the language around that is so complex that I defy most consumers to actually understand what they would be protected against and how in the events that they are, let alone when they're not. And I think, going back to the borders question, if I don't understand as a consumer why I'm protected and I'm not protected, there's very little point in me having that protection in the first place. And I think this is one of the really difficult areas for everyone to grapple with in crypto, which is outside the regulatory sphere. But if I, as a consumer, can't see the boundaries, I can't see the border lines, and Jared's friends in Iceland don't get locked up until 8 years after the event, there seems little benefit to me to actually going to the protected sector as opposed to the unprotected sector.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up there, but thank you very much, everyone, for sharing both your incredible experiences in the real and the crypto world, and also for your very carefully thought out thoughts and advice. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.